Hey everybody, this is Christian and today we'll cover how to use proxy outposts in Authentik. Authentik, as some of you might know, is the free and open source identity provider that I'm using to log into my HomeLab devices and applications. In my first tutorial about Authentik, I've already explained how to install and deploy this using Docker Compose and even integrated the Traefik reverse proxy to be able to protect applications that don't have any form of user login by themselves. Today I'd like to follow up on this topic because one question I haven't answered yet was, how do you actually connect Authentik to Traefik that might be deployed on a separate server, or maybe to a Traefik ingress controller in Kubernetes? The solution is called Authentik Outposts, and as a bonus tip, I'm also going to show you how you can use them to easily protect the Traefik Dashboard with a secure login. Hope you're gonna enjoy it, and yeah, this will help you to make your HomeLab and IT environment more safe and secure. Let's get started. By the way, if you're not using Authentik yet and you're entirely new to this topic, of course, I link you the first video tutorial in the description box down below, so you definitely should watch this tutorial first, otherwise it might be a bit difficult to follow. And just to let you know, since the last video, I've made some changes to my Authentik setup. For example, I've migrated my production Authentik installation from using Docker Compose to my new Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster using Helm. So here you can see the Helm deployment running in Kubernetes. However, for using Authentik Outposts, it's actually not really relevant where or how you have deployed Authentik. Just install it somewhere using Docker Compose or Kubernetes or Helm, whatever technology you feel the most comfortable with, and you can still use the Authentik Outposts to handle authentication and authorization requests on any other server, Docker, Kubernetes. So in my case, it looks like this. Authentik again is running on Kubernetes, and then I'm using it to securely log into any administrative system, such as my GitLab platform that is deployed on an entirely different server using Docker Compose, or my Grafana monitoring system that's also running on the same server. But I can also log into any other system like Longhorn, for example. So this is running on the same Kubernetes cluster as Authentik is, but I can also authenticate to applications that are running on different Kubernetes clusters or separate servers using Docker Compose. Like my Traefik installations, you can see I have deployed across the different virtual machines in my HomeLab. This is running on my first production application server. This Traefik installation is running on a different Kubernetes cluster, and I can just log into any service from this single Authentik installation. This is really amazing, and I'm even planning to expand this authentication system to other platforms and services that I might deploy in the future. I can simply add any login form to any service or in any environment or server that I want. Don't worry, we'll cover exactly how to do this in a minute. I just quickly want to remind you about another important topic when we are talking about authentication, and that is remote access. Because I'm using Authentik only on my local network, but sometimes when I want to log in from an external network, for instance when I'm in a hotel, traveling, or somewhere at work, I'm using TwinGate, the sponsor of today's video. TwinGate is a zero-trust network access platform that is so much better and more secure than using traditional VPNs, because it always verifies each access request. If the user isn't authenticated, the device isn't verified, or the context is suspicious, then TwinGate doesn't let the network request even leave the device. I've, by the way, also made some tutorials about TwinGate in the past. It is super simple to get access to SSH, web interfaces, basically anything that you're running locally. It creates secure and blazing fast tunnels from inside your network to your client machine, no matter where it's connecting from, or if there are any NAT firewalls in between, it just magically works. And the best is you can use TwinGate entirely for free, up to 5 users and 10 different remote networks. So definitely check out TwinGate. Start making your network more secure and safe. Of course, I will leave you a link to their website in the description box down below. Now let's get back to Authentik Outposts. So these are basically just a small Authentik component, essentially a service that you have to deploy on all your environments that you want to connect, such as any Docker host or a Kubernetes cluster, and it allows for a secure connection between the Authentik Outpost and the Authentik API that is running on the main server. And just to let you know, in this video I'm just going to focus on the proxy provider types of the Authentik Outpost, but There are also 3 other types existing, such as the LDAP provider, the Radius or RIC provider. These type of outposts allow you to connect Authentik to other types of authentication systems you might have in your environments. Also, there's another interesting advantage of using Authentik Outposts that you should know, because they allow you to offload the authentication logic from the main Authentik platform to these smaller components. So this can help a lot to improve the performance of your authentication requests. So they offer a lot of flexibility when it comes to integrating different networks and environments. The permission to access the Authentik API is done by using a service account and a token, which are auto-generated by the Authentik Outpost integration. So it's not such a big deal to deploy these small outposts somewhere. There are just a few things you have to consider when you connect to it in Traefik using Docker or Kubernetes, but let's go through this step by step. Alright, so first of all, I will show you the embedded outpost that is running in Authentik by default. So when you go to Applications and Outposts, you see a list of all the Authentik outposts that you have deployed in your network, and you can even create new ones to connect to different servers and environments. The embedded outpost is always running by default in Authentik, and if this is a fresh installation, this is the only outpost that you should see here. And this was introduced in some previous version of Authentik to simplify the proxy deployment, and this is also managed by Authentik itself. So it can't be disabled, and you should not delete it, because if you restart Authentik, it's just going to recreate this embedded outpost. And usually the embedded outpost is needed on the environment where the Authentik main platform is installed. So when you want to integrate it with other proxies that are running on the same host as Authentik, this is the embedded integration that you can choose. But if you want to connect different environments, you have to create these different outposts. As you can see, I'm running them for each server or integration that I have created, such as a different Kubernetes cluster or also my other Docker servers that I have connected here. So I think it will be best to just show you how to create such an integration, and we will just start with the Docker integration. This obviously will work a bit different than a Kubernetes integration, and I'm just going to show you both here. I think for most people the Docker integration will be the most interesting one, so I'm going to start with that here. And one thing that I probably should also mention about the Outpost integration, there is a way of manually deploy those outposts using Docker Compose or also Kubernetes environments, but those deployments have one downside here, because they are not managed by the Authentik main platform themselves. They are not automatically updated. So if you use those manual outpost deployments, it is your responsibility to update those deployments one by one when the main platform updates. And I think it is better to use the integrations so that the main Authentik platform will handle the deployment of these outposts, and it will also automatically update them. If you update the main Authentik platform, it will also push an update to all these outposts as well, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And the Docker integration can be done in several ways here. You can use the remote host's TLS connection. So this will use trusted certificate authentication to securely connect to the Docker socket. Or you can use the remote host SSH connections. So let us just go through this step by step. So first of all, I'm going to connect to a test server that I have deployed. So here I'm just running the Docker daemon. I have deployed a couple of containers that are running here. There's also a Traefik instance running. I just have access to the Docker socket locally, not via the network. Usually it's not a good idea to expose a network connection to the Docker socket, because then anyone can connect to this open port and do whatever he wants with these containers. So be careful when you're doing this. You have to add a strong protection such as TLS encryption and authentication using certificates, so that only trusted devices can connect to the Docker socket using the network connection. So let us do this. I'm just going to switch to the root user, because that's then much simpler to execute all these commands. And I'm creating a new folder. It's called certs, and I'm also cd into that directory. So you can choose any other directory that you want. It's really not that much important where your certificate files are located. I just picked this directory. It just makes the most sense for me. And then I'm just following the documentation. Basically, you can just copy and paste these commands here. I'm just customizing a few things here. So the first command, this will hold the private key of the certificate authority. And then I'm going to create a certificate for this certificate authority. Note, you can pick any certificate expiry date here that you want. You can also make it a bit longer valid, but 1 year is the default. And then you have to fill in some information for the country name, for the state, locality name, organization name if you want. So this is really not that much important for a local test environment. All right, so now that we have the certificate authority, certificate and private key, we need to generate a server certificate. So this is the certificate that the Docker engine will use. We just start again with creating a new private key for the server certificate. And then instead of creating this certificate directly, we will create a new certificate signing request, because our server certificate, of course, need to be signed by the certificate authority that we have just created. So I'm gonna pick this CN here, the server test 1. Again, you can add any subject that you want, but usually I'm using the fully qualified domain name of the server. And now it is important that we make this certificate valid for the fully qualified domain name and the IP address. So we will create a new file here. So first we will write these entries to a configuration file. So we will add the subject alternative names to the fully qualified domain name, the IP address of the internal network interface and the local IP address as well, and write it to the extfile.cnf. And we also have to add another line to this configuration file. This will make sure we can later use this certificate for a secure authentication. All right, so now we can generate the certificate based on the certificate signing request that we've created. We will sign it with the certificate authority's certificate, use the certificate authority's private key, and we use the extensions file, the xfile.cnf that we've configured with all of these settings here. All right, so then if we execute it, you can see that the certificate request self-signature is okay because we've used the correct CA and the key and stuff. All right, so now we can use this certificate to configure the Docker engine. However, we also should create a corresponding client certificate that the Authentik platform later is using to connect to the Docker server. So let's do the same thing again. We start again with a private key. We will create a certificate signing request for this client certificate as a CN. I just pick client. I think that should be fine. And we also need to generate a new extensions client.cnf file. So here we just use the extended key usage client authentication so that this certificate can be used to authenticate to the server. And then we generate the certificate with an expiry date of, 1 year. And that's it. So now we should have the following files in the directory. We have the certificate authority, private key and certificate. We have the client certificate and private key. And we have the server certificate and private key. So now, according to the Docker documentation, we have to follow a few cleanup steps here. So first of all, we should make sure that we remove all the unnecessary files. We don't need the certificate signing requests here for the server and client anymore. We don't need the configuration files, so we can just remove them. And we also should make sure that the permissions are configured correctly for the private key. Only the root user should have access to the private key. And for the certificates, anyone could have read access. So to configure remote access to the Docker daemon using TLS certificates, you can enable the remote access by configuring the Docker service in systemd. Here is the systemd unit file. So if we take a look at this file, here are all the important flags. And what we have to do is we have to override this line here, the execution start command. It is not a good idea to make any modifications in this file directly. Instead, it is recommended to create a new override.configuration file. So this will override only specific flags here that you want to change without having to modify the unit file that is managed by the Docker installation. So otherwise you might run into some problems. So let's create a new directory. And then we will create a new file that is called override.conf. Here we can modify those flags. First of all, I'm going to paste the information that I've copied from the main Docker service. And now it is important that we add the group where this flag is configured. In this case, it is used in the service group. And now you can't directly override this execution start command. You have to clean it first. So that's why we have to add one empty line here. And and the second line will set this to new parameters. So here in this file, we can append any flags to the docker d command. First thing that we want to do is we want to add another host here. And I want to pick the IP address on the ETH0 interface of the server so that the Docker socket will only accept connections coming from one IP address on this local network. And we will use the port 2376. And then we will just add the flags to add our TLS certificate. We will add TLS verify, and then we will add TLS CA cert that is located in this directory, the ca.pem. Then we will use the TLS cert. So this is the server certificates file, in my case, the server-cert.pem. And as a TLS key, we will use the private key or the corresponding private key to the server certificate, in this case, server-key.pem. All right, so that should be all. Now we can write and exit. You can see there is a warning line. So the unit file, source configuration file of the Docker service changed on the disk. And it instructs us to run this command here, systemctl daemon reload, to make sure the system unit files that we've just modified are reloaded by the systemd unit. Of course, we should execute this as root user. And then what we can do is we can restart the Docker daemon. So obviously this failed, so maybe I made a mistake, but we can just have a look in the log files. So here you can see unknown shorthand flag TLS. So probably I made a typing mistake somewhere here, so let's check. Yeah, okay, I forgot the double dash. Of course, it has to be dash dash like any other flags here. All right, so now the Docker daemon should be started, and it started with the correct flags. You can see it here in this line. So this is using the certificates. And now you should also see that the server is exposing the Docker socket here in this line when you check the open ports by the system on this IP address that we have defined on the port 2376. And now what we have to do is, let's go back to Authentik. I know this was much about Docker and not about Authentik, but if we go back now to the Authentik Outposts, we can now create a new outpost that will use our client certificate that we've generated to securely authenticate to the Docker socket on the test server. And how you're going to do this in Authentik is also pretty easy. So first of all, we need to upload the certificates that we have generated, or at least the certificate authority that we need to verify, and the client certificate that we use to authenticate. So here in Authentik, in the system settings, you can go to certificates. And here you can see a list of all the certificates that you have created, generated, or uploaded on the Authentik server. Usually it's only the Authentik self-signed certificate. So let's create a new one here, and we will start with the certificate authority. So now we go back to the server and go in the etc. docker certs directories where we have created all the relevant certificate files and private keys. And we will start with the ca.pem. So this is the certificate authority certificate. We will just copy everything in here and just paste it here. So one thing that is a bit weird in Authentik, usually the private key of the certificate is optional here. So in theory, you should not need to add the private key here, because Authentik doesn't need to generate new certificates using the CA, right? It doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, I could not select the certificate authority certificate from the drop-down list if I don't add the private key. So I don't know if this is a small bug in Authentik, but if we need it, we will just add it here. So we will cut the output of the private key of our certificate. Make sure to copy everything, paste it here, and click create. Now we also need to create a new client certificate. So I will just call it client, remove the content from the old command. What was the name of the certificate? I think it's just cert. Server cert is the server cert, and cert is the client cert. All right, yeah. Now we got that. Copy it. Put it in here, and now we have to use the private key, otherwise we can't use the client certificate to authenticate. Always make sure you select the correct corresponding files, otherwise it would not work, obviously. And let's create this as well. And now that we have the certificates, you can also see if the private key is available here and the expiry date, so when the certificate expires. You can see for my production instance, I have made those certificates valid for 10 years until I need to recreate them. For the demo one, it's just 1 year. So if you want to avoid creating all these certificates every year, you have to extend the expiry date, obviously. That will make things easier for you, trust me. And then we go into Outpost integrations. So now we can create new Outpost integrations for connecting to a Docker service connection. That's what we want, or Kubernetes service integration. So here I've just picked Docker. And then I'm just gonna give this a name, server test 1. Of course, this is not a local connection. This will use a TCP connection. And here we have to add the URL of the service. So we can use the name or the IP address, because the certificate is valid for both the IP address and the name. It is up to you what you pick here. So I'm using HTTPS and I'm just using the IP address. I think that's be easier. And the port number again was 2376. All right, so that's the Docker socket URL. And now we need to pick the TLS verification certificate. So this is the certificate authority which the endpoint certificate is verified against with. So here we pick the certificate authority, and here the TLS authentication certificate or the SSH key pair. Here we will pick the client certificate. So now we can click on finish. Here in the state, you can also see if everything is working fine. It should give you the version of the Docker engine that is running on this integration. And with the green check mark, you can see the connection is valid, the certificate is trusted, and so on. So everything is working fine. Now that we have the Outpost integration, we could start creating the Outpost. However, there's also a stupid problem in Authentik. You can't create a new Outpost without having a provider assigned to it. You can see on the test server, I'm currently not running any web applications that I want to protect with a login. So if you have an Nginx web server or maybe a different application without a login that you want to secure, you can use that. However, I thought it would be nice to just show you how to protect the Traefik Dashboard. You can usually see those statistics here about the Traefik proxy, or the entry points, the HTTP routers and stuff. And this, of course, should not be exposed without any secure login. So let's have a look how to do this. And I'm going to start with our provider. Remember, this is what I've shown you in the first tutorial. So just follow the same steps like I've described here. We will pick the proxy provider for a new provider. We will give it a name, something like Traefik Test 1, for example. We will use the explicit consent authentication flow, and we will use forward authentication. The external host, this is URL that we will later use to authenticate against. This will be traefik.server test1.home.ca-creative.de. So on my DNS server, I have created a wildcard DNS record for the server test1 to forward anything in front of this name to the IP address of the server test1. That's everything we should need for the proxy provider. Now we have to create an application as well. So let's start again with Traefik Test1. And now we will pick the Traefik Test1 proxy provider that we've just created. Where is it? Here. And now that we have that, let's go to Outposts and create a new Authentik Outpost. The type is, of course, proxy. And now it is important to use the integration so that Authentik will deploy this outpost for us on the remote server. And of course, we will pick server test1, so the integration that we've just created, and the application that I want to make available via this outpost, and this is the Traefik Test1 application. So let's move it into the selected apps. And now it is important that you not directly start create. It is important to configure one or two settings here. So let's go into advanced settings. This will show you the configuration of the Authentik proxy. And here you can see a template that is valid for both Docker, but it also has some Kubernetes flags in here that we actually don't need because it's not a Kubernetes integration. So we can just remove it and leave those by default. These settings I have found out to be very important. So the first one is the Authentik host. This is usually the default, so we can leave it or we can remove this setting, it doesn't matter. Authentik host insecure, host browser, we don't need these flags here. And the log level trace, yeah, you can configure the log level just like you want, but I'm also going to remove it and leave it by default. Also refresh interval, the container image, that is all default is also fine. So I'm just going to use these settings. The Docker network. So this will be important because, as you might know, if you want to connect from the Traefik reverse proxy that's running on the remote Docker server to the Authentik Outposts. They have to be in the same Docker network, right? So that's important on the remote server Docker network ls. And see, I have created like a backend network, I've created a front-end network and the default bridge network. And the Traefik reverse proxy on my remote server, by the way, is located in both networks, front end or back end. So we could use either of those. It doesn't matter. But I'm just going to pick front end. I think that will be fine, right? And those settings here, Docker map ports and labels, we can also remove. So those are important. And if you want to customize, so when Authentik will start generating this outpost, it will use an object naming template. So this is the name of the Docker container that is deployed later. And I like to customize it and use the same name as the server name. So I like to get rid of this prefix here and just replace it. Those are important to set. Anything else is optional or up to you. And now we can hit create. So no, the magic is happening in the background. Hopefully everything is working fine, but we can check. So here we can refresh from time to time to see if the Authentik Proxy Outpost is being deployed and is able to connect to the Authentik main platform. We can check if on the remote server there should be a new container generated. Currently, it's not there. There it is. So you can see it is created, but it's not running yet. So for some reason, it's not starting automatically, but I will just try to start it. Okay, so this is now starting up. I don't know why I have to start it manually. So maybe I'm gonna check later what's the problem with that. But as I can see here now, the container is up and it seems to be healthy. So if we go back to the Authentik Dashboard and just hit refresh, the server test Authentik Outpost is up and running. It shows up the version last seen 10 seconds ago. So it is connected to the main Authentik platform and we can use this proxy outpost. All right, so what we have left to do, we have created the outpost. This is running on our remote server. And what we've also done is we have created the application and the provider for the Traefik Dashboard. What I haven't done yet is modified the Traefik reverse proxy, added the correct labels, and also enabled the dashboard. So that's the first thing that I want to do. And now I'm gonna add the Traefik labels to make sure this is exposed. I want to use the Traefik reverse proxy itself to generate a new router. And then I want to make this available on the hostname traefik.servertest1.home.c creative.de. So make sure this matches exactly what you have configured here in the provider as the external hostname. So those have to match here. That's important. Of course, I want to expose it using TLS, so make sure to add it on the entry point web secure, enable TLS, and I also need a trusted certificate using Cloudflare, so I'm using my certificate resolver. And I also want to make sure that this is using the internal port 8080, because otherwise it might use a different port. And remember, the Traefik Dashboard is running on the internal port 8080, so that's why we have to set it here in the load balancer server settings. What we now have to do is we have to generate a middleware for the Authentik proxy. This is the same process like we've done in the first tutorial, just that the application was running on the local server where Authentik was deployed. Now it's running on a remote server. So let's generate a new configuration file and just paste it from the documentation. And now what we have to change is, we have to change this here, outpost.company, and replace it with the name of the Authentik Outpost container running on the same Docker server. So in my case, this is server test1 Authentik Outpost. Remember, that's why I said it is important to change the server templating name so that you definitely have always the same name that you can add in the middleware. I think there's just one thing left to do. We have enabled the dashboard, we have created the middleware. Now in the label files, we have to tell the Traefik reverse proxy to use this middleware. So we have to add a new label that is called http routers traefik.middlewares. And we have to set this to the name of the middleware. In my case, I'm just using the name Authentik. So whatever you have added here as a name, you should refer to here. And it's important to add an add file. So to tell the Traefik reverse proxy, note this middleware configuration, you have to load from the middleware's configuration. Okay, good. So I think that is everything we have to do. So now I can recreate the Docker container. So I'm just going to take the project down and I'm going to take it up again with a D. The container is started. And now, if we start making a request to the Traefik reverse proxy, we should be forwarded to Authentik. So let's try to open it by using traefik.server-test1.home.c-creative.de. And yep, you can see we are redirected now to authenticate. So we have to authenticate and log in with a secure key or username and password. So that's it. Let's click on continue. And now, because we have choose the explicit consent, it will tell us again, you're about to sign into Traefik test 1 information. Let's click on continue. And this will take us to the Traefik dashboard. Again, this is just a demonstration, right? So you could add any other service in here, add a different compose file like an Nginx web server, use these labels here, use the middleware, and create a provider and an application. Don't forget to move this application to the Authentik Outpost. So when you add another application on the Docker server, you have to go back in here, go to Outposts, pick the outpost where the application is deployed, move the application from the list here in the Authentik Outpost for a selected application to make this work. And then you can protect any other application that you expose via Traefik with a secure login. This is really cool. So I know this is a lot you have to follow. It can be complicated because there are a few separate things involved, like the Docker engine, TLS authentication. There is the Authentik instance you should have running somewhere. You have to have the Traefik reverse proxy running. You have to create the middleware and the outpost. I know this might be a complicated tutorial to follow, but if you follow all the steps that I have explained in the first tutorial and in this one, it should work for your environment. And if you still have problems, well, you can just check out my boilerplates repository on GitHub. So this is a repository where I'm collecting all the templates. For example, if you go to Docker Compose and go to Traefik, you can see how many deployments I have collected here. This is nice. You see a template for creating a Traefik reverse proxy. In the config directory, I've also added examples for the Authentik middleware. You can see what you have to configure. There is the Traefik configuration file with all of the settings that I'm using. So definitely check out this repository. This is always going to be helpful if you want to follow the templates I'm using in this tutorial. Link in the description, of course, down below. And yeah, before I finish this video, I think it's already pretty long, but I just wanted to show you how the Kubernetes integration works. Don't worry, the Kubernetes integration is surprisingly much easier than the Docker integration, because the only thing that you have to do if you want to create an Authentik Outpost for Kubernetes, you have to go into a system Outpost integrations, create a new integration, select Kubernetes servers config, and what you have to do is here add the kube config file of your Kubernetes cluster. So this is super simple. By the way, why not just let's do it together? I have a Kubernetes cluster up and running for testing. So if I just select kube test 1, here you can see, I think do I have deployed the Traefik reverse proxy here? Oh yeah, I have, right. So I could set up this here if I want. So I think this is located on server test 3. So this is the Kubernetes cluster where it's running. Here is the configuration file. So this is a kube file that we have. Let's just copy this. So one thing that is important, of course, this is using the local IP address. Of course, you have to configure it with the external IP address. I'm using the https kubetest1.home.c-creative.de. I think that will work. Of course, this is not a local integration. Kubetest1, this is external. So let's click on finish. This should show you the version of the Kubernetes nodes. So that's working. And now we can create a new Authentik Outpost for this integration as well. So what we have to do, again, we have to create a new provider. I'm just going to call it Traefik Test 2. I think that will be fine. Explicit consent, forward auth. And the FQDN will be traefik.kubetest1.home.c-creative.de. Of course, HTTPS. Fine. And we have to create a new application for it as well. Traefik Test 2 provider is this one here, the corresponding provider that we've generated, and yeah. So let's generate a new outpost. I will just call it Cube1 Authentik Outpost. Proxy integration, of course, and the integration will be kube test 1 and the Traefik test 2 reverse proxy I want to expose. And before we create this, of course, we need to change the configuration settings again. So we don't need log settings. We don't need the Docker network because this is a Kubernetes integration. What we need is Kubernetes replicas, Kubernetes namespace to make sure this is created in the Authentik namespace. And we might want to change the naming template and set it to this name. The service type will be cluster IP. I think this is fine. And the only thing that I want to change here is usually Authentik is also creating or generating an ingress for this Authentik outpost. And I don't want this. I only want the connection to be inside the Kubernetes cluster's local network and not coming from outside using an ingress route. So what I will add here is a Kubernetes disabled component setting, and this will be ingress. Okay. Now we can generate the outpost. Now we have the outpost. Of course, we have to change the Traefik dashboard to be enabled. Here, I'm just gonna copy one of my templates here. You can see this is basically the same stuff that we've done in Docker. I am just with a Kubernetes manifest using Traefik Web UI middleware name. And here in the address, we of course have to change this to the name of the deployment, kube test 1 Authentik Outpost. So we have to refer to this address here, dot the namespace where the deployment is located, and then .svc.cluster.local. So this will be automatically resolved by the Kubernetes core DNS, internal DNS server, to the internal IP address of the deployment pod. And then the middleware will forward the authentication to the outpost here. All right, so that should work. We just need to apply this setting. And then in the Helm values, we need to change this setting. And then we just refer to the name Traefik Web UI middleware. So the same name as the object has that we have deployed. And then we just need to redeploy the Helm deployment of Traefik. So hopefully everything is correct. Yep, so has been deployed successfully on that namespace here. I think that also has updated to the latest Traefik version. And now we can try to see what happens when we open a new connection. And yes, you can see it redirects us to the Authentik login. Because I am already logged in with this session to Authentik, it just gives me the consent to redirect me to the Traefik test 2 dashboard. And yeah, so here we are at the dashboard of my Traefik ingress controller deployed on the testing Kubernetes cluster. So now we have connected one Docker host and one Kubernetes cluster to the Authentik main platform using the Outpost. I think this is really amazing. And if you now want to use that to protect any application deployed on your servers or clusters, you can basically follow the same procedure. You have to deploy the Authentik Outpost on each environment where your services and applications are running. You have to integrate the Traefik reverse proxy using a middleware that forwards the authentication and authorization requests to the Outpost. And then at the Authentik main platform, you have to create the application and the provider with the correct settings of the service you want to protect. I know it's a bit complicated, but if you once got the process you have to follow in your head, it's actually always the same. I hope this was helpful to anybody who is using Authentik and Traefik reverse proxies, and you now got a better understanding of how Authentik Outposts work. And make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks everyone for watching, especially all the supporters of my channel, and I'm going to catch you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.